The bar smelled like burnt wood and cheap whiskey, but it was still Randy's favorite spot. It was a quiet place to think, a place to drown the kind of memories that refused to die. The door creaked open, and like a bad punchline to a joke he didn't want to hear, Teresa walked in. She hadn't changed much, same soft waves of hair, same fire in her eyes that used to light up his darkest nights. Only now, that fire belonged to someone else. Randy didn't flinch. He just lifted his glass in a silent salute to the woman who wore his ring once, the same ring he had picked out on a day he thought meant something. He watched her glide across the room, every step wrapped in confidence, her fingers tangled with Howard's. Howard, the guy Randy once called his brother from another mother, the guy who knew every late-night secret Teresa and Randy ever shared. It was funny how betrayal didn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it slipped in through the back door, smiling and shaking your hand like an old friend. Randy chuckled under his breath and tipped his drink back. He thought he'd feel anger when he saw them together. He thought he'd want to flip the table, break a few glasses, maybe even throw a punch or two, but all he felt was hollow, like a building everyone had already moved out of. Karen slid onto the bar stool next to him, her perfume cutting through the smoke like a breath of spring. She was a soft kind of beautiful, the kind that didn't scream for attention but got it anyway. Karen had been there when everything crumbled. She had seen him at his worst, and yet here she was, smiling like he wasn't a complete disaster. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low enough not to carry. Randy shrugged. "Never better." Karen raised an eyebrow, not buying a word of it. She glanced over at Teresa and Howard, then back at Randy. Her look said, "Everything you deserve better. You know that?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The past was heavy enough without trying to explain it to someone who already understood. Teresa laughed at something Howard whispered into her ear. It wasn't the sweet laugh Randy remembered. It was sharper, almost like she was trying to hard. Randy turned away, signaling the bartender for another drink. As the glass slid across the counter, he caught his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. He didn't see a broken man. He saw someone free. Someone who had finally figured out that loving the wrong person didn't make you weak, it made you human. The night stretched thin around them. Karen talked about her new job, her brother's wedding, the little things that reminded Randy that life went on whether you wanted it to or not. He laughed at her jokes, real laughter this time, the kind that came from someplace genuine. Across the room, Teresa watched him, her smile faltering for just a second. Randy caught it, the hesitation, the flicker of regret. Howard noticed too, tightening his grip on her hand like he could anchor her if he just held on hard enough. Randy stood up, tossing a few bills onto the bar. Karen looked up, her eyes full of silent questions. "I'm good," he said, his voice steady. "Really?" Karen smiled and stood with him. Together, they walked past Teresa and Howard. Randy didn't look back. He didn't need to. The story had already ended. The ring had meant something once, but promises are only as strong as the people who keep them. And as Randy stepped out into the cool night air, he felt lighter. No anger, no sadness, just freedom. Teresa wore his ring once, sure. Howard wore the guilt now, heavy and obvious. And Randy? He wore a smile and left. The cool night wrapped around Randy like an old friend as he and Karen made their way down the quiet street. The sky stretched out wide above them, dark and endless, dotted with stars that looked too far away to matter. Randy stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets, feeling the leftover weight of everything he'd just walked away from. But with every step he took, it got a little easier to breathe. Karen kept pace with him, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She didn't talk much, and he liked that about her. Some people filled silence because they were scared of it. Karen knew silence wasn't something to fear, it was just space to figure things out. They stopped outside a diner that still had its neon lights buzzing, casting a tired pink glow over the sidewalk. Randy turned to her, giving a half smile. "You hungry?" Karen shrugged, but there was a grin playing at the corners of her mouth. Always. Inside, the diner smelled like fried onions and burnt coffee. It was mostly empty except for a guy in the back booth scribbling in a notebook and a waitress who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. They slid into a booth by the window. Randy picked up a menu, but didn't bother reading it. He already knew he'd just order whatever greasy thing came first. Karen leaned back against the seat, her eyes soft, studying him. "You're handling this better than I thought you would." Randy laughed under his breath. Guess I'm full of surprises. She didn't say anything for a second, just watched him, like she could see every thought running wild in his head. You know, she said finally. Some people would have caused a scene back there. Thrown a punch, made a mess. Yeah, Randy said, smiling a little wider. But then they'd win twice. Not just my heart, my dignity too. Karen nodded, looking impressed. Smart. He shrugged. Or maybe I'm just too damn tired. The waitress shuffled over, snapped her gum, and took their orders. Randy got a double cheeseburger and fries. Karen asked for a stack of pancakes even though it was way past midnight. When the food came, it was messy and perfect, just the way late night food should be. They ate in easy silence for a while. Outside, the street was empty, the whole world slowing down for the night. It gave Randy room to think, to feel, without the constant noise of what ifs and should haves. He thought about Teresa's hand resting in Howard's, about the flash of guilt on Howard's face, the small, crumbling crack in Teresa's smile. Maybe once upon a time, he would have fought for her. Maybe he would have stood there like a fool, begging for an explanation he already knew he didn't need. But now, he saw it for what it was. They didn't betray him because he wasn't good enough. They betrayed him because they weren't good enough. Karen stabbed a piece of pancake with her fork and pointed it at him. So, what now? You gonna mope around for a month, write sad songs, and swear off women forever? Randy chuckled. Tempting. But nah, thinking I might just live. Do my thing. Maybe travel. Travel, huh? Karen smiled, her eyes lighting up. Anywhere? Special? Hell, maybe everywhere. She laughed, a sound that was way too bright for the middle of a broken night. Well, when you get to Italy, send me a postcard. Randy leaned back, feeling the knot inside him start to loosen. Deal. The diner lights buzzed overhead, and for the first time in a long while, Randy felt like maybe he wasn't stuck anymore. Like maybe the past could stay exactly where it belonged behind him. Karen finished her pancakes and leaned her chin on her hand, studying him again. You know, it's weird. What's weird? You smiling like that, she said. Like you're actually happy. Randy thought about it, really thought about it. Then he smiled wider, real and easy. Maybe I am, he said. Outside, a soft breeze kicked up, carrying away the last ashes of something that was never built to last. And inside that quiet little diner, Randy figured something out. He wasn't losing anything anymore. He was finally free. After the diner, the night air hit Randy a little sharper, but it felt good, like a slap on the back from a friend who meant well. He and Karen walked without any real destination, the town around them half asleep, the streets washed in the soft hum of streetlights. Karen's arm brushed against his now and then, easy and familiar. She talked about silly things at first, how she hated her boss, how she wanted to buy a motorcycle even though she was scared to death of crashing it. Randy listened, smiling, grateful for the sound of someone who wasn't asking him to explain himself, who didn't expect him to bleed just to prove he was still breathing. You know, Karen said, kicking a loose pebble into the gutter. You could come with me. Randy gave her a sideways look. Where? On the suicide motorcycle tour? She laughed, tossing her head back, her hair catching the light. No, idiot. On a road trip. No plans, no maps. Just see where we end up. He thought about it, really thought about it. There was a time not long ago when he wouldn't have even considered it, when Teresa had been the sun and everything else had to orbit around her. But now he didn't owe anyone anything except himself. Yeah, he said after a minute. Maybe I will. They stopped by an old park, the swings creaking in the breeze. Randy dropped onto one of them, letting the chain rattle under his weight. Karen sat on the swing next to him, her legs barely brushing the ground. For a long time, neither of them said anything. It wasn't awkward. It was just quiet in the way that mattered most. You ever think about what went wrong? Karen asked after a while, her voice soft. Randy pushed the swing back and forth with the tips of his boots. All the time. And he shrugged. I think we both wanted something from each other. We couldn't really give. And when the cracks showed, we both pretended they weren't there. Karen nodded like she understood more than he was saying. Maybe she did. She'd been around long enough to see it, the slow unraveling. The way Teresa smiled less and fought more. The way Randy stopped fighting back because he was just too damn tired. You deserve better, Karen said. Yeah, he agreed, and for once, he meant it without bitterness. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed and a dog barked. The world kept spinning, indifferent to broken hearts and new beginnings. Randy leaned back, looking up at the stars. That didn't care either. Funny thing is, he said, I don't even hate them. Karen smiled a little. That's because you're not like them, maybe. Or maybe he just finally learned that hate was a chain too heavy to drag around anymore. After a while, Karen stood up and stretched. Come on, road warrior. Let's at least plan a fake trip. Randy grinned and followed her to a bench. She pulled out her phone and opened up a map, zooming out until the whole country was just a tangle of lines and colors. Where to first? She asked. Randy stared at the screen for a second, then pointed without thinking. West. Always west. Karen laughed and dropped her head onto his shoulder for just a second, long enough to feel her warmth. West it is. The night was thick and quiet, the kind that usually made Randy feel small, but sitting there with Karen, dreaming about miles of open road and towns they hadn't ruined yet, he felt bigger than he had in years. He didn't have a ring in his pocket anymore. He didn't have a home that felt like a lie. He didn't even have a plan, but he had a direction. He had the beginning of something that wasn't built on broken promises. He had himself, and for the first time, that was enough. The next morning came too bright and too early, but Randy didn't mind. He packed what little he had into an old duffel bag: 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, a leather jacket that had seen better days, and a few crumpled bills he scraped together from his dresser drawer. No photos, no keepsakes. If it couldn't fit in a bag, it wasn't coming. Karen pulled up outside his apartment in a beat-up green pickup truck that coughed a little when it idled. She leaned out the window with a grin so wide it made Randy laugh, despite the way his stomach twisted with nerves. Ready to make some bad decisions? She called. Born ready, he said, slinging the duffel bag over his shoulder. He climbed into the passenger seat, the door, groaning in protest. The truck smelled like coffee, vanilla, air freshener, and a little bit of gasoline. It smelled like freedom. They didn't talk much at first, both of them lost in the simple rhythm of the road. The town fell away behind them, shrinking into a memory. Randy didn't even look back. He didn't need to see Teresa's house or the bar where everything started falling apart. Those places didn't hold anything for him anymore. Karen fiddled with the radio until she found a classic rock station. She tapped the steering wheel in time to the beat, her hair flying around in the open window breeze. Randy closed his eyes. For a second, letting the music drown out the last echoes of old conversations. He didn't want to remember. It felt good. Better than good. It felt right. They drove through towns so small you could blink and miss them. They stopped at a gas station where the pumps looked like they hadn't worked right since the 80s. Karen bought a pack of gum and a couple of candy bars while Randy filled the tank, watching the numbers roll by slower than molasses. High class dining, she said, tossing him a Snickers as they got back on the highway. Better than some fancy restaurant where they charge you $50 to starve, he said, ripping the wrapper open. The day stretched on, the scenery changing from tight little neighborhoods to wide open fields where the grass bent in the wind like waves on the ocean. Randy felt something unraveling inside him, something he didn't even realize had been tied so tight. Around sunset, they pulled off at a rest stop. It was nothing special: a couple of vending machines, a broken payphone, and a few picnic tables. Battered by the weather, but the sky was on fire, streaks of orange and purple stretching across the horizon like some wild painting no human hand could ever match. They sat on the hood of the truck, eating chips and drinking warm soda, watching the sun slip away. You ever wonder what would have happened if things went differently? Karen asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Randy shrugged. Sometimes. But then I remember it didn't. And maybe that's the way it was supposed to be. Karen nodded, kicking her boots against the bumper lightly. I used to think about it all the time. Like, if I'd just said something sooner, maybe you wouldn't have gotten hurt so bad. Randy turned to look at her, really look. Her eyes were filled with that quiet kind of sadness, the kind people carried for others when they couldn't save them. He reached over and bumped her shoulder with his. Wasn't your job to save me, Karen? She smiled, a little shaky but real. Still wish I could've. The sky faded into deep blues and blacks, the stars coming out one by one. Randy leaned back on his elbows, staring up at them. I think, he said slowly, sometimes you gotta let the wrong people walk away so the right ones can walk in. Karen looked at him for a long second, her expression unreadable. Then she laid back beside him on the hood, shoulder to shoulder, watching the stars. Yeah, she whispered. I think you're right. The night wrapped around them again, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt wide open, full of roads they hadn't traveled yet, full of places they hadn't seen, and somewhere out there, beyond the broken promises and the wasted tears, Randy knew there was a future waiting that didn't have Teresa's name carved into it anymore. The next few days blended into a long stretch of highway and sky, towns they barely remembered the names of and cheap motels where the wallpaper peeled in the corners. Randy didn't care. He liked the way the days bled together, liked how there was no plan, no real destination, just movement, forward. Karen made playlists on her phone, wild mixes of rock, country, pop, and the occasional heartbreak song that made Randy smirk and shake his head. They sang along badly, rolled down the windows even when it got cold, and talked about everything and nothing. One afternoon, they stopped in a town that looked like it had been abandoned, and only half remembered to wake up again. There was a diner, a gas station, and a tiny pawn shop squeezed between two boarded-up buildings. Karen's eyes lit up when she spotted the pawn shop. Come on, she said, grabbing Randy's arm. Let's find some treasure. He let her drag him inside. The place smelled like old books and regret. Rows of dusty guitars, cracked picture frames, and broken jewelry cluttered the shelves. Randy wandered to the back where a glass case held watches, coins, and a few tarnished rings. Something pulled at him, a tiny voice he hadn't heard in a while. He leaned closer and saw it, an old silver ring, simple and a little dented, but clean. It was nothing like the gold band he had given Teresa. No diamonds, no promises tied to it, just a plain, honest circle of metal. Karen appeared beside him, chewing a piece of gum. You thinking of buying something? Randy pointed at the ring. Maybe. Karen raised an eyebrow. You sure you want to go down that road again? He smiled, shaking his head. Not for anyone else, just for me. He bought it for $5 and slid it onto his right hand, feeling the cool metal warm against his skin. It wasn't a chain. It wasn't a memory of something lost. It was just a reminder that sometimes you could start over without carrying the wreckage with you. Karen watched him, her face soft with something he didn't want to name yet. Maybe it was understanding. Maybe it was hope. They left the shop and wandered down the cracked sidewalk. A little boy played with a battered soccer ball in an empty lot, laughing like he didn't know the town around him was falling apart. Randy envied that, the ability to be happy without needing a reason. Karen nudged him with her elbow. You look lighter, feel lighter, he said honestly. They grabbed lunch at the diner, greasy burgers and milkshakes served by a waitress who looked like she'd been working there since the place opened. They sat by the window, watching the sun sink lower, painting the town in gold and amber. Karen dipped a fry in her shake and popped it into her mouth, grinning when Randy made a face. Don't knock it till you try it. He stole a fry from her plate and hesitated, then dunked it into his own shake. He bit down and laughed. Okay, that's weirdly good. Karen beamed, victorious. See? Trust me more often. Maybe he should, Randy thought. Maybe trusting Karen wasn't such a bad idea. As the sun touched the horizon, Karen looked at him seriously. Where to next? Randy thought about it. Thought about running until there was nothing left of his old life to haunt him. Thought about hiding in new cities, blending into new crowds. But sitting there with her, he realized he didn't want to run anymore. He didn't need to hide. He just needed to keep moving forward. West, he said again, smiling. Always west. Karen clinked, her milkshake glass against his. To the west, and whatever we find there. They finished eating, climbed back into the truck, and hit the road again. The sky darkened around them, but the headlights cut a clear path ahead. Randy rested his hand on the windowsill, feeling the wind whip against his fingers, the old silver ring catching the occasional glint of light. It didn't hurt anymore, not the way it used to. Teresa was a chapter he didn't have to keep rereading. Howard was a ghost he didn't have to keep chasing, and whatever waited for him out there, he was finally ready to meet it head on. The next state line came and went without much ceremony, just a faded green sign and a few honks from cars speeding past. Randy and Karen rolled through it like ghosts, the miles stacking up behind them. The truck rattled over an old bridge where the river below shimmered under the moonlight. Randy kept his hand out the window, feeling the air grow cooler. Karen hummed along with the radio, some old love song that neither of them really listened to. At a gas station just past the bridge, they pulled over to refuel and stretch their legs. The place was nearly empty except for a guy in a dirty flannel, shirt filling up a rusted van, and an old woman smoking by the entrance. Randy leaned against the truck, watching Karen as she rummaged inside for snacks. She popped back out a minute later with a grin and a bag of sunflower seeds. Survival food, she said, tossing it at him. He caught it easily. We're really living like kings. Karen winked. That's us. Highway royalty. Randy chuckled and ripped the bag open, popping a few seeds into his mouth. He wasn't used to feeling this way, light, unburdened, like maybe life didn't have to be a series of losses stacked one on top of another. Karen wandered over to a payphone near the side of the building. She picked up the receiver, held it to her ear for a second, and laughed. Deadline, she said. Like everything else around here. Randy walked over to her, smiling. Maybe that's a good thing. No one can call us back. She let the receiver dangle from the cord and leaned against the wall, looking at him. The way she looked at him made something stir deep inside, something he wasn't sure he was ready for but didn't want to run from either. You think we're really running away? She asked, almost as softly. Randy shook his head. No running. Away would mean we're scared. We're just letting go. Karen studied him a second longer, then nodded. Good, because I'm not scared. Neither was he. Not anymore. They got back in the truck and drove on, the road unfolding in long, lonely stretches. Ahead of them, somewhere around midnight, they spotted a motel with a neon sign flickering weakly against the dark. Vacancy. Karen pulled in without a word. Inside the tiny office, the clerk barely looked up as he handed them a key. Room 12. The room smelled like bleach and mothballs, but it had two beds and a working heater. Randy tossed his bag down and flopped onto one of the beds, staring at the cracked ceiling. Karen kicked off her boots and crawled onto the other bed, lying on her stomach, flipping through channels on the battered TV. Static. Old sitcoms. A black and white western. She finally settled on a late-night cooking show where a smiling woman chopped onions with terrifying speed. You think she's hiding something? Karen asked deadpan. Randy laughed. Absolutely. Nobody cuts onions that happy unless they're running from something. Karen snorted and buried her face in the pillow. Maybe she's got a body in the freezer. They both laughed harder than the joke deserved. The kind of laughter that comes when you're too tired, too wired, too free. When the TV started blurring into a low hum in the background, Karen sat up, her hair messy and her eyes sleepy. You know, she said, you're different out here. Randy turned his head to look at her. Different how? She shrugged. Lighter, stronger, like you're not carrying all that old weight anymore. He thought about Teresa, about Howard, about the nights he spent trying to figure out where he had gone wrong, and he realized Karen was right. The weight was still there, but it didn't own him anymore. I guess I just decided I'm not letting them have any more of me, he said quietly. Karen smiled, small and real. Good, you deserve more than that. Randy didn't know what to say to that, so he just smiled back. They stayed up a little longer, talking about places they wanted to see: deserts, mountains, cities with lights so bright they could wipe out every old memory if you stood under them long enough. Finally, when even the TV couldn't keep their eyes open, they fell asleep in their separate beds. The sound of the heater rattling in the corner, and outside, the night held its breath, waiting for the two broken souls who had decided, without saying it out loud, that they weren't broken anymore. Morning found them wrapped in the kind of silence that wasn't heavy, just easy. The motel curtains let in a thin slice of pale sunlight that cut across Randy's bed, warming the worn-out blanket. He stretched, his muscles aching from too many hours behind the wheel and too few hours of real rest. Karen was already awake, sitting cross-legged on her bed, flipping through a battered notebook she must have pulled from her bag. She looked up when he stirred, smiling in that soft way that made it hard for him to breathe sometimes. Morning, road warrior, she said, voice still thick with sleep. Morning, he mumbled back, sitting up and scrubbing a hand through his messy hair. She closed the notebook and tossed it onto the bed. I made a list. Randy raised an eyebrow. A list? Karen grinned. Yeah, places we need to see before we're old and bitter. He laughed, swinging his legs off the bed. Pretty sure I'm halfway there already. She shook her head. Nah, you're just bruised, not broken. The words hit him harder than he expected. He wasn't used to people seeing the difference. Most folks back home just assumed bruised meant broken, that if you fell once, you'd never really get up again. But Karen wasn't most people. They packed up quickly, tossing their bags into the truck and grabbing a couple of terrible coffees from the motel lobby. The coffee tasted like burnt rubber, but Randy didn't complain. Bad coffee on the road was practically a rite of passage. As they pulled back onto the highway, Karen read off from her list. First stop, she said, is a ghost town about 50 miles west, supposedly cursed. Tourists hardly go there anymore. Randy smirked. Perfect. Let's go get cursed. They found the place just after noon. The town was nothing but hollow buildings, sun-bleached wood, and rusted signs swinging in the breeze. Dirt crunched under their boots as they walked down the empty main street. It was eerie, but beautiful too, like stepping into the bones of something that once had life, laughter, hope. They wandered through an old saloon where shattered glass still littered the floor, past a blacksmith's shop with broken anvils and walls covered in graffiti. Karen stopped in front of an old church, its steeple half collapsed, the doors hanging open like a mouth stuck mid-scream. You ever think, she said quietly, about how everything that seems permanent just ends up like this? Randy looked at her, the wind lifting her hair, the sadness creeping into her voice. Yeah, he said, but maybe that's not a bad thing. She turned to him, frowning. I mean, Randy continued, if everything lasted forever, you'd never know how precious it was. You'd never fight for it. You'd just take it for granted. Karen looked at him like he'd said something important, something she needed to tuck away for later. They walked into the church, stepping over broken pews and cracked tiles. At the front, sunlight poured through a shattered window, casting rainbows across the dust-filled air. Karen sat on a pew, still standing, tapping the wood lightly with her fingers. You think, she asked, if you could go back, would you do it all different? Randy thought about it. Thought about Teresa, about Howard, about the nights he'd sat alone wondering how the hell it all fell apart. No, he said finally, because if I did, I might never have ended up here. Karen smiled, slow and genuine. Good answer. They sat there for a while, letting the silence speak for them. Randy felt something inside him settle, something he hadn't even realized was still restless. After a while, Karen stood up, brushing dust from her jeans. Come on, before the curse kicks in and traps us here forever. He laughed, following her back into the sunlight, back onto the road that stretched out in front of them. Waiting, the truck's engine roared to life, and they drove away from the ghost town, leaving behind only footprints and a piece of the past neither of them needed anymore. Ahead, the sky opened up, wide and endless, and for the first time, Randy didn't feel like he was running from something. He was running toward something real. The miles rolled by under their tires, each one carrying Randy a little farther from the man he used to be. The truck hummed along the quiet road, a thread of dust trailing behind them like smoke from a fire long gone out. Karen had her boots up on the dashboard, sunglasses perched on her nose, singing along softly to a song that barely played above the rumble of the engine. Randy smiled without even realizing it, not because of the song, not even because of the freedom, just because for the first time, in a long, long while, he wasn't pretending anymore. They drove until the sun began to fall again, the sky bleeding out in streaks of gold and pink. Karen pointed ahead, toward a small overlook that jutted out over a valley carved deep into the land. Without a word, Randy turned off the highway and pulled into the dirt lot. They climbed out, walking toward the edge. The valley stretched wide. Below them, a quiet sea of green and shadows, the mountains like sleeping giants guarding the edges of the earth. It was the kind of view that made you forget every stupid thing that ever broke your heart. Karen sat down on the edge, legs dangling over the cliff, fearless as always. Randy lowered himself beside her, feeling the solid ground under his palms. Neither spoke for a while. They just sat there, two small figures against the immensity of the world. Finally, Karen broke the silence. You ever wonder what she'd say if she could see you now? Randy thought about Teresa, about her polished nails, her sharp tongue, the way she used to pick at his dreams like loose threads. Once, he might have burned for the chance to show her he was okay, to prove he didn't need her. Now, he just shrugged. Maybe she'd be sorry, he said. Maybe she wouldn't. Doesn't change anything. Karen smiled sideways at him, the breeze lifting her hair off her shoulders. Good, because you don't owe her anything. Randy let out a long breath, feeling the last, invisible T-eyes snap inside him. No more what-ifs. No more trying to fix what was already broken. Karen nudged him with her shoulder. You ever think maybe you were just too much for her? He blinked, caught off guard. Too much. Yeah, too kind, too real. Some people can't handle that. They want the idea of love, not the work of it. Randy stared out at the valley, letting her words settle somewhere deep in his chest. Maybe Karen was right. Maybe Teresa loved the idea of him, the steady guy, the one who would always stay, even when it hurt. She just couldn't love the real version when things stopped being easy. Maybe, he said. The sun dipped lower, painting the world in a final flood of light. Randy felt the warmth of it on his face, on the old silver ring on his finger. He glanced at Karen, the girl who had chosen to stand beside him without asking anything in return. Thank you, he said quietly. Karen tilted her head. For what? For not letting me stay stuck, he said. For reminding me there's more out here than what I lost. Karen smiled, small and a little sad. You never lost anything, Randy. You just made room for something better. Maybe she was right. Maybe the best parts of life weren't behind him after all. Maybe they were still out there, waiting just past the next mile marker. The stars began to prick through the darkening sky. Randy lay back in the dirt, hands behind his head, staring up at them. Karen lay down beside him, their shoulders brushing, neither of them saying a word. They didn't have to. The road was still out there, stretching beyond the horizon, wild and unknown. And Randy realized that was the best part, not knowing. Not needing to know. He wasn't the man who wore a heavy ring tied to broken promises. He wasn't the man desperate for answers anymore. He was the man who wore a simple silver band for himself, the man who had finally learned that sometimes leaving wasn't losing, sometimes leaving was winning. And sometimes, the best kind of love wasn't the one you chased down, it was the one that found you when you finally stopped chasing everything else. Randy closed his eyes, the sound of the wind, the stars, and Karen's steady breathing filling the night. Tomorrow, they would keep driving. Tomorrow, they would find a new place to belong. Tomorrow was theirs, and for the first time in forever, Randy couldn't wait. The end.